I'm Stephen Smith, IIEP Director. Professor Aronson has put together a terrific program here, which we'll be getting to in just a moment. I'll just provide about 3 minutes or so of introduction about IIEP and what we are doing. We promote high-quality research in many aspects of the global economy, primarily in the areas of development economics and poverty alleviation, international trade, and international finance, but also some other subject areas, including international business. We have 4 signature initiatives that we've operated here for over 5 years now. One is on extreme global poverty. A second is on economics of adaptation to climate change. A third is on China's economic development and U.S.-China economic relations. And just about 3 weeks ago, I think it was, approximately, we had our 8th annual day-long symposium on this. And next fall, put it on your calendars. I don't know if we have a day, but keep in mind our 9th annual U.S.-China conference will take place, and you can get all of the presentations and PowerPoints, as well as some video online at our website, which is gwu.edu/IIEP, IIEP for Institute for International Economic Policy. So our last, but certainly not least, of our 4 signature initiatives is global economic governance in the 21st century, of which our Internet initiative is a major and really central part. I'd like just briefly to thank one of the supporters of our event today, who's an anonymous donor, but we want to express our gratitude for his assistance. And so now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to David Viorst, who is the Executive Director of the Internet Policy Forum, who will provide the next step of this introduction. So once again, thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you at events in the coming months as well. Thank you.
And thank you. My name is David Viorst. I'm the Executive Director of the Internet Policy Forum, which is an initiative of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society. We provide a forum or a hub for discussion about key issues facing the Internet, including Internet governance and all facets of Internet policy. We have an upcoming event on December 14th about Internet capacity building for nonprofits and NGOs that will focus on Internet security. We are proud of the work we have done with Susan Aronson over the past few years, and we are very proud to be able to co-sponsor this event. Over the next 6 months, we will be conducting seminars and series on safeguarding the DNS and the future of the Internet infrastructure. We will be also covering Internet security, and we will be doing work on creating an ethical Internet of Things. Thank you very much, and I'd like to now present you with our distinguished moderator, Tracy Samuelson of Marketplace. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Tracy Samuelson. I'm a reporter with Marketplace, and we are the daily business and economic show on public radio stations across the U.S. So one of my favorite pet projects recently has been reporting on the TPP, and I had the pleasure of attending negotiating rounds in Maui and in Atlanta. So we are all very excited to be here today. We're going to cover a lot of ground. Privacy issues, IP protections, how data moves across borders, how it's protected, maybe some encryption, net neutrality. We've got a lot of buzzwords, and this is a tiny percentage, actually, of this massive agreement. So before we get started, a couple quick thank yous. Thank you to everyone for coming. We're going to save lots of time for questions, so please, as you're listening, be thinking about things that we're missing, things that you want to know about. Thank you to Kyle Renner and his incredible staff who've handled all of the logistics here today, to David Viorst and Paul Brigner with ISOC DC. They're also providing webcasting in case you want to go back and re-listen to anything you've heard here. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the people sitting next to me. So we'll start with Susan Ariel Aronson. She's a research professor at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, and the reason I'm personally here, so thank you, Susan. Fanny Hidvegi is the International Privacy Fellow at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. Mark McCarthy is Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association. And Peter, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher, we just talked about this. You want to say? May Barduk directs Public Citizens Access to Medicines and Knowledge Economy Group, and also was in Maui and Atlanta and many other negotiating rounds. And Sandy Rebeck is the Director of Global Public Policy at Akamai Technologies. They're a content delivery network and cloud services provider. And you've also actually, I think, worked for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative?
A long time ago, that's right.
Okay, so he's the one of us, I think, that sat on that side of the table, so we're happy to have you here. So I think we'll start with Susan. We'll do some brief 6 or 7 minute statements from each of the panelists, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up. So Susan?
Sounds great. Okay, so the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, it's not on? The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative claims, and let me quote, that TPP will help to enable an open internet. And so my hypothesis, what I wanted to know is that correct? And so I guess I have to answer that question by saying it's one big if, right? And so I would like to make 4 points about that big if. First, it has to go into effect. But if it does go into effect, it will cover 800 million users. 800 million users are about 1/4 of the open internet's current user base. So that's sizable, right? And how those users behave will have an impact on how other users behave. The second point is that I think TPP could have positive effects if policymakers use its provisions to enhance human welfare. And I'll go into more detail about that shortly. Thirdly, I think it could have those effects if and only if this chapter on e-commerce is read and operationalized, forgive my bad English, but let's use it, with the other chapters, including chapters on transparency and regulatory coherence and financial services. So you have to read those chapters and view them together with the e-commerce chapter. And then finally, other nations would have to take TPP's provisions and use them to build in other agreements. And that too is a huge if. So let me expand further. On the positive side, clearly, the language in TPP does facilitate the free flow of information because it limits protectionism, or digital protectionism in particular, and it talks about how and when, so in a sense, it sets limits to how and when nations can stop the free flow of information. But if you read it carefully, it really says very little about netizens, and that's no different from any other trade agreement. It only talks about service providers. And that's how, right, that's how trade agreements regulate business, then they regulate behavior of governments. They regulate, but they don't often speak explicitly to market actors. Interestingly, in TPP, it does talk a little bit about netizens in terms of privacy and in terms of internet governance principles. So it's got some interesting stuff in that regard. But I think the exceptions were not explicit enough as to how and when nations can limit the free flow of information. And I was surprised by that because in previous trade agreements, although those trade agreements were aspirational, they had much clearer language as opposed to broad language related to how and when nations can limit the free flow of information. Okay, so what does it all mean? And you have, I think you could get a copy of my policy brief to look at this in more detail. But first of all, I do think I have no idea if TPP will be approved. Obviously, there's been a lot of opposition to several of its chapters. But if it is approved, I think that will lead to many other nations wanting to join TPP. We've heard already Colombia, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand want to join. So, and many of those nations already have FTAs with many of the existing trade, the countries that have already agreed, it's not enforced yet, but have already agreed to TPP. So that means a lot more netizens will be regulated, if you will, by its language if it goes into effect. Moreover, other governments that have not signed on are going to have to comply with TPP when they send information to TPP countries. Hence, my gut is they will want to build on it, right? Because they already have to deal with this regulation for much of their information flows. And so it could be a guidepost for other trade agreements. And I think we will know this soon at the WTO Ministerial in Nairobi. Now, there have been a lot of critics have expressed a lot of concerns about TPP, and they're most concerned about privacy and IPR, and I believe they have rights to be concerned. We do need to rethink our approach to, in my opinion, online IPR and the role of internet intermediaries in policing the web. But I also think these critics have not really balanced the positive nature of these provisions with their concerns. They have focused on specific chapters rather than looking at it as a coherent whole and seeing how regulatory coherence, internet governance, and governance in general might be affected by TPP. I also think many of the critics have confused the means and the ends. Like them, I have been furious that the process has, in the United States at least, has been so, shall we say, unaccountable and transparent, and not transparent. But, so the right to criticize the process, because I think the process has not been modernized for the internet age, which is strange. Yet, at the same time, I think the critics have been unwilling to see the benefits of the agreement, especially if other governments follow the broad paradigm. Moreover, I think the transparency of the TPP could have really important democratic spillovers, and we can talk about that later on if you want. So in sum, I see a lot of potential in TPP, but we have to remember that TPP is a big if, and it can only meet its potential if other nations, A, adhere to its rules and use its provisions to encourage access to information and to challenge censorship and filtering as barriers to information flows. So thanks so much for coming and for hearing this perspective.
And Fanny?
Thank you. First of all, I must admit that I'm a human rights lawyer and I'm not a trade expert, and this is no longer an excuse, and I'm forced to learn this new language of trade. Well, as the flyer of the event says, the Trans-Pacific Partnership includes many provisions that have significant effect on the internet and data flows. And as we all know, data flows are key for trade, but the economy in general, and stakeholders emphasize all the time how and why it is important to businesses. And what I'd like to talk about today is what is important for people and the discrepancy between TPP and human rights, and privacy in particular. And my starting point here is that there's a growing consensus that privacy and data protection should be recognized as global fundamental human rights. But that's not the premise of TPP. Instead, TPP recognizes, and I quote, the economic and social benefits of protecting the personal information of users of electronic commerce and the contribution that this makes to enhancing consumer confidence in electronic commerce. So even though TPP claims to offer some degree of protection, this language is a red flag for a human rights lawyer. And I agree that protecting personal information, of course, does have economic and social benefits, but this is not the reason why a country should guarantee the fundamental right to privacy and data protection. Instead, it should be a legal obligation arising from the nature of privacy recognized as a fundamental right. The countries signing TPP agree that they all allow the cross-border transfer of personal information, And the only reason why a party may introduce limitations to these data flows is to achieve a legitimate public policy objective, which is totally unclear what that means. But it's safe to say that the goal to increase privacy would be considered as such. However, TPP also says that measures to protect personal data in this case cannot be a disguised restriction on trade, among other things. What this means is that this agreement uses a completely inverse logic, and it is making trade the fundamental right and privacy the state interest, which can override the fundamental right only if it is least restrictive of trade. Well, on the positive side, TPP does call for signatories to have a privacy regime in place. And to offer greater certainty, there's a footnote in TPP what that could mean. And according to TPP, this privacy regime could be equally acceptable if it's comprehensive or sector-specific or self-regulatory. From a fundamental right perspective, comprehensive frameworks are always more favorable than sector-specific laws, but I think the real problem is the option of self-regulation. And if we talk about self-regulation, we must at least mention safe harbor, which is coordinated by the Department of Commerce, and that program allows U.S. companies to self-certify policies, and instead of complying with legal requirements, they can use self-certification of processing data of Europeans like myself. And of course, TPP does not regulate data flows between the EU and the US, but I think we should learn from the experience with Safe Harbor. And it has become clear that industry-developed self-regulatory strategy doesn't meet the requirements for fundamental right protection. And as you all know, I'm sure, the Court of Justice of the European Union declared the Safe Harbor arrangement invalid. And I believe that the TPP's cross-border provisions will face similar challenges and criticism as they have already faced. And as a final thought, I'd like to argue that the US doesn't meet the necessary requirements for an adequate privacy regime. It certainly meets the very low threshold of what TPP sets out, but in my point of view, this agreement shouldn't be the standard for global privacy. EPIC has been long arguing that it has never been more need to update the US privacy laws, and there are identity theft, data breaches, financial frauds all over the place. Americans today worry about retailers who lose their credit card information or data brokers that sell their family's medical information to strangers. We believe that industry self-regulation has failed. And according to my view, there's a very clear strategy that would enable transborder data flows, but protect the interest of US consumers as well. And we can go into details in this strategy, but just be very brief. I believe that the US should enact a comprehensive legal framework and establish an independent privacy agency. Of course, the US should end the mass surveillance of non-US persons and offer judicial redress to all persons, regardless of nationality. There's a long debate, and I think it's clear that the US should stand up for strong encryption and reject any law or policy that would undermine the security of consumers and internet users. And with regard to TPP, we have all seen how harmful secrecy was, as Susan mentioned, and I believe that parties should commit to transparency and the full participation of civil society from now on. The task is global, and it is to provide adequate safeguards, including redress mechanisms, transparency, and I think we all should work to restore the true meaning of informational self-determination as we say it in Europe, and this is regardless of nationality. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Mark?
So I'd like to thank Susan and GW for putting together this panel discussion. I think it's going to be fun. The first two statements indicate the range of the conversation. I want to speak from the point of view of the Software and Information Industry Association. And when I testified a couple of weeks ago before the the House Judiciary Committee, we hadn't seen the text of TPP at that point. Nevertheless, based on what USTR had said, I was pretty positive about what was in the agreement on cross-border data flows. Well, the text is now out, and we're very pleased. The cross-border provisions are a clear step forward compared to earlier trade agreements. Data and server localization mandates are forbidden, subject to reasonably tight exceptions. You can read more about our reaction in the excellent blog by our international policy expert, Carl Schoenander. It's on the table outside if you want to grab it on your way out. But my point today is slightly wider. I want to say that businesses and human rights groups should both be delighted with the cross-border provisions in TPP. And why is that? For years, human rights groups and businesses have complained when authoritarian governments censored the internet in their own country and blocked content from offshore websites. China is the standard example, but countries like Turkey, Vietnam, Malaysia, and even Australia have looked to impose content controls on information coming into their country via the internet. Now, the U.S. has resisted these obstacles to the free flow of information on the internet, as it has historically resisted all such restraints. Many of you know that a key feature of U.S. foreign policy in the post-World War II era has been to try to persuade other countries to embrace the free flow of information. In 1946, the U.S. State Department said, "Freedom of the press and freedom of exchange of information generally is an integral part of our foreign policy." We got this principle into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Same principle is embodied in the International Covenant on Civil Rights. In 2000, then Secretary Hillary Clinton, in her remarks on internet freedom at the museum, set as a goal of U.S. foreign policy to establish and maintain a single internet where all of humanity has equal access to knowledge and ideas. And in 2012, the United Nations Human Rights Council said, "The same rights that people have offline must also be protected online, in particular freedom of expression, which is applicable regardless of frontiers and through any media of one's choice." So the good news is that this ideal of foreign policy and human rights has been reflected in a trade agreement. Now, there's always been an argument from scholars like Tim Wu and Hosaku Makiyama and others that existing trade law, in particular GATT, could be applied to outlaw internet censorship. But this argument was always a stretch. After all, the internet was barely functioning as a generally available public medium in 1994 when GATS was signed. In TPP, however, the connection between the free flow of information and trade policy is made explicit. Here's the key provision. Each party shall allow the cross-border transfer of information by electronic means, including personal information, when this activity is for the conduct of the business of a covered person. Well, that's the dry language of trade agreements, not the lofty language of human rights. But the point is the same. Transferring information across borders is now a protected activity. Of course, countries can still censor information flows, but they now must justify these restrictions in a way that looks similar to the way that the U.S. protects speech under the First Amendment. TPP makes this clear by allowing a measure that restricts information flows to achieve a legitimate public policy objective, provided that the measure does not impose restrictions on the transfer of information greater than are required to achieve the objective. Under U.S. jurisprudence, measures that restrict speech based on its content face heightened scrutiny. It requires that the government must have an important reason to regulate speech and must narrowly tailor that regulation to the evil that the regulation seeks to address. The TPP language that I just quoted contains a similar recognition by preventing restrictions on information flows from being broader than required to achieve a legitimate objective. In this way, TPP implements the goal of the free flow of information, not in a human rights treaty or instrument, but through the different mechanism of a trade agreement. Now, the other provisions of TPP need to be evaluated as well, and a balance has to be struck. And I think that's why we see so many trade associations and companies still evaluating TPP as a whole. But if the only measures that TPP contained were these cross-border information flow provisions, TPP would be a victory for commerce and for human rights alike.
Thanks, Mark. Peter?
Can you hear me? Okay, very good. You got it controlled? Okay. Switching to the lapels now. My name is Peter Maberduke. I'm the Global Access to Medicines Program Director at Public Citizen, now also a broader knowledge economy group. We have a few materials outside, a press release, an analysis of the e-commerce chapter in the TPP by my colleague Burcu Kilic, who's here today, and also some pages on the GATT and GATT's exception measures, which I'll talk about briefly. So this is the Trans-Pacific Partnership right here. It's 6,194 pages long, and this is double-sided, by the way. About that much, probably tariff schedules, probably about 4,000 pages. That still leaves about 2,000 pages of rules to govern the economies of the 12 signatory countries, and potentially more if more countries sign up in the future. Now we have to think about that. Countries have spent years negotiating this in secret, and we can't edit it any longer. This whole thing is going to be put up for an up or down vote after what we would consider to be inadequate scrutiny to really determine some of the consequences, intended or unintended, of some of the provisions. So the things we talk about today and the different ideas that we'd like to see embedded in this text, improvements that can be made, unless we can find a way to reopen the negotiation, it's too late to make those improvements. We're just going to have to live with it as it is. And we could make changes in the future to a different agreement, but unless we come up with some mechanism that restructures or is binding over TPP, which is a very difficult long-term project, these provisions are going to hold, and they're going to govern our law, and they're going to govern the laws of the other 11 member countries. Now, for someone like me who focuses on some other issues and rules that affect access to medicines and create broader monopolies for the pharmaceutical industry, that's a pretty clear-cut issue. It's our opinion that people are going to die if this goes into effect. And so we should run a balancing test, but I think we have to have in mind some of the really serious consequences that come from the totality of a document like this. So I think in a forum like this, one of the key questions, and Susan has foreshadowed it, I think, is, and as has Fanny, is what do we mean by internet freedom? And what sort of forum is this to define internet freedom? The U.S. Trade Representative, the stakeholders involved, I think everyone on this panel in one place or another has, I think, been pretty clear that the purpose of trade agreements is to advance industry interests, and the key stakeholders for the U.S. Trade Representative office certainly are industry. And in the context of internet rules, we're largely talking about the content industry on the one hand, Hollywood, publishers, and so on, and the information technology companies. Now, there are moments when our interests align, quite significant moments, and there are moments when those industry interests are competing with each other. So organizations like mine, consumer advocacy groups, have been allies with the information technology companies when it comes to trying to limit the exclusive powers and the overreach of the content industry. But it would be a tremendous mistake for us in this room, or for, I think, sort of the United States political framework, to think of industry interests as a proxy for our own interests in internet freedom and defining what user rights online mean. Because information technology company interests do not line up with ours, do not line up with the public interest necessarily in areas like privacy and data sharing and data protection. And so Fanny got it right when she said what TPP does is sort of invert the structure. It is trade uber alles. It's the trade rules first, and then trying to build in some limitations so that public interests aren't trampled. But the limitations never go far enough. Two key areas of concern are privacy and the public domain, and we'll just touch on them, and maybe we'll have more time in questions. So Mark introduced the issue of data flows and the data flow provision. So it seems to us, and I think a lot of other groups that work in internet issues, that there's a great many times there's advantages to facilitating the free flow of information. There's advantages to having limits on server localization rules and others. It does not necessarily follow that we would want a blanket ban or prohibition on all rules that would condition the transfer of data or have localization in some cases. And that's essentially what the TPP introduces. The TPP says you can't restrict data to storage on a local server. You can't keep the data. Ultimately, you can't keep the data in your country. It's going to be moved. It's going to be moved. And there have been discussions about how that can be conditioned, and there's an exception in the text, but it may be pretty hard to get through that window. So this comes into play in things like there's the Europe-US safe harbor discussion, central idea that if we export data outside the United States or another country exports their data, will it be subject to the same rules and protections in another country? When IT companies move the information across the border, can they ensure the same level of data protection as exists in the host country? And Europe introduced a voluntary structure which it is now determined is inadequate that would say you've got to meet our standards if you're going to move the data. Now, if you want to make that binding or enforceable, you're going to have a problem in the TPP. You're not necessarily going to be able to say that data doesn't move unless you can guarantee the same standards of protection for our personal data as operates in the source country. Now, this works under, sort of second point, even though server localization may often be disadvantageous and can support things like censorship, there are also times when it's a way to protect sensitive data. A secret may be safer in one box in one country rather than 6. So Australia, for health information, I believe, keeps data on, requires data be kept on servers in Australia and not moved beyond it. Also, countries have surveillance concerns. They don't necessarily want data moving all over the world to places where it'll be easier for the NSA or other agencies to grab it, spy on it, or for the information to be hacked. So there are legitimate reasons to have some of these policies in place. Even if we want to discourage certain trends, it does not necessarily follow that we want to ban the provisions. Now, when we raise this argument, people say, well, okay, but there's an exception. And there's even in the sort of general exception section, it even references data protection. And that's true. The exception is derived from, although the negotiators tried to make some useful changes, but it's derived from these longstanding exceptions in trade law and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATT and GATS. And there's a series of tests. There's a diagram, I think, on page 5 of our exceptions handout. You can see that you have to clear to get through it. And it sounds reasonable on its face, but countries challenge, when they've had their domestic policies challenged in these tribunals, they have invoked exceptions 44 times, invoked the exception, the right to sort of defend these policies 44 times. They have lost 43 of those cases. So only once did a domestic policy actually survive the GATT and GATS challenge and make it through. So, and the privacy language that's in there, you'd still be subject to all the other tests. It only gets invoked if you can get through these other tests. And so we're talking about rules on dolphin-safe tuna, rules on a Brazilian rule on not retreading tires because it's dangerous. We're talking about the clove cigarette ban in the United States, limitations on online gambling, all public policies that were struck down that invoked the exception and the right to legislate in the public interest and lost anyway because these things were deemed more trade restrictive than absolutely necessary. And who decides? Well, trade panels, trade lawyers decide, and the standards are evolving. They're not necessarily the standards that we would apply in this room. So can you get a privacy exception? Can you get a rule through that says, here's the absolute least trade restrictive way to protect data and condition the transfer of data on a host country, protecting people's personal information the same way that we do? it's hard. There is some language in the TPP also. There was reference. There is a separate provision that's on the protection of personal information, but it only says we're going to set up. You should have a national framework of some kind. That doesn't really affect the cross-border transfer, and it doesn't say what kind of framework to have. So that's the sort of consistent problem that we come back to in the trade agreements. Is a pretty big difference between the tough binding standards that are there to protect the industry interests and the soft language is there to provide some safeguards to the public interest. I'm sure I'm over time, so I'll try and just very quickly touch on the issue of privacy in the public domain and copyright measures. So the intellectual property chapter is it 70 pages or so in the agreement, and the content industry has lobbied very hard to get stronger protections for copyright online. And one of the worst losses there from a public perspective is that now all these countries are going to have a copyright term of life of the author plus 70 years, which doesn't have economic benefits, doesn't incentivize creativity when you're keeping works out of the public domain that long. It is, as the Electronic Frontier Foundation said, essentially a transfer of wealth from users to the big content companies. There are also a series of provisions that ramp up penalties against users, including potentially in cases where there actually is no copyright infringement or a case that might be a fair use of copyrighted material. So I think for a lot of netizens, this is perceived as that's a restraint on speech and culture and our use of material that either is or should be in the public domain. So, right, I'm done.
Great, so we'll move on
Yeah,
to
okay.
Sandy.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Tracy. I'd like to thank GW and the DC chapter of the Internet Society as well for making this morning possible. And it's good to see that we're all completely aligned in our views on this. Nothing much to talk about. I'll try to just hit a few points at the outset so we can leave more time for discussion and questions. First of all, many of you in the audience are probably imagining who is this guy and what is Akamai Technologies. So maybe just a minute on what we are. We are not a consumer-facing company. We're a business-to-business company, so our name might not be as familiar to some of you in the audience. But if you've watched a video on your phone, if you've worked remotely from home, things like that, you've probably taken advantage of our technology. We basically have a system of servers deployed around the world where we try to cache material close to the end user so that your user experience on the internet is more efficient. So the internet itself is not as clogged, and things that can stay close to you are close to you. Now, we don't generally deal in personal information, so while these discussions are interesting, they don't generally affect us. But it is, when you're looking at something like streaming the Summer Olympics, if some of that information can be stored close to you rather than having to go all the way back to Hollywood, New York, or Rio de Janeiro, that really opens up the internet for everybody. So it's who are our customers? Our content providers. But content providers are media companies, they're businesses, they're people who have blogs. We represent some of the biggest internet companies commercially today, but we also have as our customers those who want to be the big companies tomorrow. So we really see ourselves in some sense as an internet enabler. And last bit of the commercial, because we have these servers deployed worldwide, we've also found that they can be useful in guarding against cybersecurity attacks. Denial of service attacks often take down websites. We're able to deal with some of those at the edge of the internet and thereby make it easier for the rest of the internet to keep going. Okay, so what do we think of this agreement? We haven't taken a formal position on it yet, and I don't plan to do that this morning. For those of you who have taken a formal position on the 6,000 pages, I congratulate you. It's been out for about 3 weeks. I think we've talked about how there are interlocking provisions, that a provision in one chapter needs to be read in context with the provision in the others. So I think it's quite reasonable that you've seen that people are trying to figure out what's in this. Maybe they're asking questions of the government negotiators, and all that is proper and appropriate. I will say that what we've seen thus far and our general perspective on some of the obligations that have been talked about thus far, we generally think are probably a step forward. We think this notion of allowing cross-border data flows is critically important. And it's not just personal data, it's any kind of data. If you're trying to stream your blog across borders and someone's paying to see it, and even if they're not in many cases, that's something that would be protected by this agreement. Things like data localization and server localization, we think that is something that is inefficient Companies need to be able to, if we're going to take advantage of the new cloud economy, companies need to be able to do that in a way that's efficient. If they have to put servers in every locality in every country around the world, that becomes incredibly expensive for companies, and those costs just go on to consumers. And by the way, it's certainly not clear to us that having a server within a country makes the data on that server any more secure. It may just make it a better target for hackers to go after. And I think we've seen that in many circumstances. And there's also some provisions about limiting the forced transfer of source code, which we also, I think, generally support. We've talked about some of the exceptions here. We'll talk more about that. I guess just a couple of points. Everybody knows if you participated in Black Friday, there's an increasing chance you did it online this time. We're not just trading widgets in the marketplace anymore. More economic activity and actually freedom of expression is moving online. So from an economic perspective, the International Trade Commission, which is a nonpartisan commission of the U.S. government, did a study in 2011. And they said that just digital trade increased the U.S. economy by between 3.4 and 4.8% in 2011. So somewhere between 3 and 5%, roughly. Think about our growth rates today in the United States. They're generally around 2%. So digital trade is giving a big boost. And I think it's important that we think about that Netzians are not only value freedom of expression as we do, but they also value having jobs and having a way to make a living. And all these things need to be taken into account. But actually, more practically, if you're traveling overseas and you want to, if you need medical attention and they need to access your medical records, those are probably back at home. You need a free flow of information to be able to get that into the place you are. If you're domestically in the United States and you want to buy products overseas, you need the free flow of information to be able to effectuate that. If you're taking a flight anywhere around the world, free flow of information is required there. And lastly, we haven't talked about the Internet of Things, and I won't spend too much time on that, but increasingly, businesses are finding that without necessarily dealing in personal information, if they can get information on how their products are working in the marketplace, they can make improvements going forward. You need the free flow of information to effectuate that as well. And I think also even in healthcare, we've seen if you can gather metadata in a certain way, you might be able to make some projections about the course of diseases, the course of epidemics, and other things like that that are important and society benefits from that. So those are things I think we also need to keep in mind as we're talking about free flow of information and personal information as well, which is incredibly important. So what do I think about the agreement and how should we approach these agreements generally? I'd suggest kind of it's a two-step process. The first step is this agreement a net positive? And different people in different places will have a different perspective on that. Some will look at the entire agreement. Some may look at specific chapters. But is the agreement a net positive? I'm reminded of the phrase that Ronald Reagan used when he first ran for president against Jimmy Carter and won. His basic tagline, which really swung the election, was, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And most people said, you know what, these last 4 years have been terrible, we want Ronald Reagan in. So I guess the first question is, will you be better off under this trade agreement? Does this have enough positives to outweigh the negatives? So if the answer is no, then you can proceed apace, hopefully after careful study. If the answer is yes, I think the question becomes, is this agreement good enough? Is it good enough? And I guess the question there is, can it be improved in a realistic time frame by realistic means? There are a lot of things that aren't in this agreement, and having worked on trade agreements in the past, I can tell you no trade agreement is perfect. There are going to be things that people are disappointed by, but we need to keep in mind that this is an agreement that was negotiated by the United States and 11 other sovereign nations. No country got everything they wanted in this agreement. So when we're balancing out whether to try to reopen negotiations or try to work around the edges, and there may be some creative ways to do some of those kinds of things, we need to keep that in mind. Last point, the world's not standing still as we're debating TPP. And I think Mark alluded to some of the trends that we're seeing around the world, but from the perspective, I think, of technology companies and just U.S. industry in general, we're seeing some very worrisome trends in a lot of other countries. And I think Netzians should be concerned about those things too. They are trends in which countries are implementing policies that do restrict speech, that do restrict commerce. There is basically a concept out there called internet sovereignty, which means that an individual country should have complete freedom to dictate who can say what on the internet, how they say it, using what equipment for what purpose. That's something I think generally in the United States that we don't favor, but that is a trend that we're seeing get more and more support. If the TPP actually sets up a counter trend to that, that generally favors free flows of information, expression, and commerce, that's probably a good thing. That's a good counterweight to some of these other kinds of things we've seen. Thanks.
Okay. So let's pick up on Sandy's first question. Is this a net positive? You are exempt because you said you're not weighing in. Peter, we'll just do a quick lightning round. No.
No. We're still looking at it.
It's a big if. But
I'm not pushing you in one to say
yeah,
one way
I
or
know.
the other if you
I
don't
think part of the problem is internet governance. Trade agreements are made by governments, and internet governance is a multi-stakeholder process. And if you care about human rights, and if you care about multi-stakeholderism, you find the trade policy-making process appallable. But that said, given where the world is going in terms of trying to balance information flows and human rights, I feel very strongly that TPP is a step forward. Is it what I'd like to see? No. Could the language be improved? Yes. But in a negotiation among 12 countries to get this, the impact on countries like Russia and China that have information security orientations, and we can explain that in a little bit, I think it's good. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
Just a fun fact, Hungary's prime minister used the same campaign line as Sandy quoted, and this is how we got into a semi-dictatorship in Hungary. So.
Well, excellent. I must have read that subconsciously, but I don't endorse that.
Okay, so just to back up here for a second, we have a lot of firsts in the TPP, especially with these digital and internet-related provisions. Is this the right place, the best place for those provisions?
I guess I'm happy to start on that. I'm not sure what the best place is, but I think we've talked a little bit about how much of the global economy is in cyberspace now. So I don't think you can talk about having a trade agreement and not address some of the issues of things other than tangible goods. There's just no way around it. Might there need to be other things as well? Are there appropriate discussions to be held in other fora? Perhaps. But I think in terms of what this agreement needs to address, if it only addressed, how much we were able to sell widgets for in what particular country, it really wouldn't be dealing with most of what economic activity is today.
Could you also discuss these same issues in other contexts? Sure. But to put free flow of information in the context of a trade agreement is an enormous advantage, and I think we should all recognize that.
So the TPP actually talks about cross-border data transfers, which might be a little different than the free flow of information, the human rights concept, right? And I think that we have to keep coming back to that point that for me, it's a little hard to gauge in internet issues specifically, net costs and benefits. I think we have to be very mindful of the costs because we can't necessarily undo them. So it's a pretty serious problem. It would certainly be better to be discussing these types of issues in forums which are susceptible to greater public input and democratic debate while the documents are being negotiated as opposed to after, and in a forum where the express purpose of the agreement is not to sort of look at all the industry trade-offs among countries, but to think about the democratic values that are involved in a process like this and push for stronger benchmarks there.
I'd like to comment on that. I do think it is a great dilemma that to many human rights activists that a trade agreement, which is widely seen as undermining many human rights, but actually, I think, again, you have to look at the agreement as a coherent whole and what it does to governance. And, anybody who wants to, I'd be pleased to point you to empirical studies that look to the relationship between, for example, the WTO agreement, because we can't do it really with any other agreement, because that's much more universal, right? 162 countries. versus, 3, which doesn't tell you anything in NAFTA. But what is the impact on how nations govern and how they are accountable to their citizens? And if you look at the transparency and regulatory coherence chapters, governments like Vietnam are going to have to make major changes to how they govern and how they interact with their citizens. And so, again, when you study human rights, you learn that you can't put one human right above other human rights. But, and there should be no but to this, but I would say that surprisingly and shockingly over time, trade agreements do have these spillover effects that are worth looking into. That said, could it undermine the idealism that we'd like to see with privacy rights? Does it lead to a better form of governance of that? No. But then again, can you expect that? This is the first binding agreement related to these provisions. So it probably won't be the best from the start. It will be interesting to see how it affects the negotiations in TTIP and at the WTO should they proceed.
If I could quickly just jump in on that last point, I think this is the first step towards a trend to include the free flow of information in other trade agreements. Susan mentioned TTIP, but it's also going to be considered in TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. And is the provision that we have right now in TPP perfect? No, I think as Susan has mentioned, it's not explicit enough. It's clearly a step forward compared to previous trade agreements, but we look forward to further progress in the future trade agreements.
Well, my view is that having in mind the process itself, it undermines the legitimacy from the first place. So even if this was the best agreement ever, because of this process, it wouldn't be as legitimate. And also, it's not a problem that a trade agreement involves some human rights issues. The problem when this trade agreement wants to set the standard. And when we speak about compatibility, what the agreement encourages, it means the lowest minimum standard. So I can see that in some cases, countries might increase protection, but on a general basis, it drives towards a minimum common point.
Tracy, could I just jump in on that? Maybe the secrecy part, because I think it's a very important part. There's been a lot of slams on the agreements because they've been conducted in secret, and it's a secret agreement. Look, transparency is an incredibly important objective. It has to be. To get buy-in in a democratic society, it's basically a precondition. But I don't know of an example where sovereign nations are negotiating an agreement that's going to fundamentally affect their rights and obligations, that they do that in the public square. Now, there has been there are advisory committees that have been set up to provide input on that provide not just business input, but also input from labor and NGOs. There's been congressional oversight of this, and Congress established the objectives for TPP. And finally, we're in the midst of having a public debate on what this agreement is and is going to be, and that could stretch out for the next 12 months. And while it's true that the agreement is an up or down vote, we're perfectly free as a society to vote it down and try to improve it or start again. So transparency is incredibly important. There may be other things that can be done on the side, but just because this is the way this came about, I don't think that is something that should be held against what the result is. And if there are improvements in the process, let's talk about them specifically.
So getting back to what Susan and Fanny were saying, so the idea of a step forward versus enshrining less than ideal standards, can we talk about the precedent that we think TPP might set, especially as we look towards, as Fanny mentioned earlier, Europe, TTIP, and safe harbor issues?
Well, first of all, I think this notion that TPP sets a privacy floor and that the floor is going to be a ceiling is misguided, because I think what's going to happen is actually the United States is going to have to move its privacy standards up and may have to move from a voluntary approach to a more regulatory approach. It's interesting.
Why do you think that?
Because basically, privacy is much more important to Europe because Europe has said, so I'm really looking at what will TPP do to TTIP? And, you know, this is not, the EU has said many a time, our privacy standards are non-negotiable. So I think the United States, U.S. companies have already acclimated, that's the wrong word, but adjusted to the right to be forgotten, as example. And it's quite costly for them. And I think it's had side effects that no one anticipated, which is, my gut is it's made it a lot harder for European companies that are smaller to compete against Google, which has the funds to comply with these very high standards. That said, the United States is going to have to adhere to something akin to find some sort of mutual recognition of standards, which is, I think, what we'll end up with. So it won't, by definition, be a ceiling, because the United States just is going to have to give on that because the EU is not going to bend. That said, also, if I may, the EU has already, to its credit, greatly challenged the negotiation process by making its positions more transparent. I think we need more of this regulatory competition, how we make trade policy, and I am so grateful to the EU for trying to do that. I want to correct one misnomer about the advisory committees. USTR this year had the opportunity to create a public interest advisory committee that would include a broader cross-section of people affected by trade, not just taking the positions of firms that are influential or that Congress cares about. It rejected that, apparently under pressure from labor unions. So the advisory process is not as multi-stakeholder as it could be. And I think, you know, USTR really, if it wants to achieve these agreements, I think USTR has to a great extent to rethink how it interacts with people as it makes trade policy. I agree with Sandy's point, because he's a former trade negotiator. You can't do negotiations in the sunshine. That's what negotiations are. But can you do the run-up to negotiations? Can you make the process more accountable? Can you involve more members of the public? Yes. Why not crowdsource an area that's particularly difficult? As example, online IPR and the role of ISPs. Is there a different way to do this? You know, use the crowd as a means of trying to rethink how we do this. Again, I'm not saying that negotiations should be done in the sunshine, because they can't. Because otherwise, you know, the bargaining would be harder. But are there ways to make it more transparent? Yes.
So if I can make a comment on trade agreements and privacy, I think it's probably a good thing that the TPP included a general requirement that there be a privacy regime in place in the signatory countries. Doesn't go much beyond that. And that's probably where it should stay. The one place where trade agreements might want to focus on privacy is in the area of international data transfers. So the exact details of a privacy regime probably shouldn't be negotiated in a trade agreement. But there has to be, I think, some provision for companies to satisfy the details of a privacy regime, short of a country saying, well, we have a privacy regime, so you can't take any information out of my country. And that really is the focus of the interest in a trade agreement. Make sure that those provisions for international transfer allow for the transfer of information once the local privacy rules have been satisfied. What that does is prevent privacy rules from acting as a form of digital protectionism. Countries say that's not why they're putting those rules in place, but if the only way you can satisfy the rules is by keeping the information in the country, then it does begin to look like a form of protectionism rather than a form of privacy protection. If, on the other hand, there is a way of satisfying the rules, and once you satisfy the rules and you can move the information, then that should be something that could be accommodated by a trade agreement.
Okay, I think we'll open up to questions now. If anybody has, I think there are microphones.
May I jump in on that one? I don't think
Sure.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I don't necessarily disagree with many of the things that have been said here today. I just put some emphasis in somewhat different places. Right? TPP is a precedent, but it's also a binding body of rules. We all have to live like this. This will be incorporated in the U.S. law and the laws of the other countries. So we can't necessarily just change it or make the adjustments later. And in an area like the data transfer issue, that's potentially significant for many countries, including the United States, because so far as I'm aware, and there are people on this panel I think probably know better than I do, but it's not an area where the United States has specifically legislated yet. We haven't said that necessarily data should always move or data shouldn't move. It's generally free to operate now, but Congress hasn't addressed that issue. We might in the future want to establish a privacy regime that conditions transfer of data on adequate data protections in the recipient country, and we may well be foreclosing that option with TPP. If we vote yes on this agreement, we don't necessarily have that chance later because we have to live by TPP or we get sued. And we can try and raise the exception. We may or may not win, but it's also likely that the legislative process would be chilled from the beginning because we don't think we can follow that route because TPP precludes it. So I think we need to understand the nature of what we're doing, that this is not, this is not just something that we build on. The rules are binding and can't necessarily be amended. In terms of the advisory committees and sort of the process, one concern is with regard to the Public Interest Committee, there were a lot of concerns that it was essentially going to wind up being a Public Interest Advisory Committee ghetto where groups would sort of air concerns that would not necessarily translate in any changes in the agreement itself, because that goes to the nature of what the agreements are trying to accomplish. There's a set of binding rules that USTR is working on implementing for the benefit of the businesses that ask for them, and then there are certain limits or soft language around those rules that are put forward for interests like environment, labor, and so on. When you hear the Obama administration messaging about this agreement, they'll cite sort of unprecedented labor and environment rules in those chapters. It's not principally the labor and environment rules per se that the labor and environmental groups care about. It's all the other damaging binding rules that are in the agreement that they're trying to limit that keep going further with each new agreement and that we all have to live by. So in the end, with this, as in all issues, it's what kind of internet do we want, who decides, and do we think it's adequate at this point in time? I mean, I take that, yeah, it's very hard. It's a hard process, right? To an extent, we want to take the opportunities we can get to go after something like censorship in Vietnam or anyone else. Very important. At the same time, like if we treat this as our proxy for internet governance, that's a pretty significant democratic failure.
Hi. My name is Burcu Kılıç, and I work with Peter at Public Citizen. And we had a similar, I was at IGF, Internet Governance Forum, 2 weeks ago in Brazil, and we had a similar workshop there on trade agreements. And the title of our workshop was How Trade Agreements Shape the Future of Internet Governance, because for Internet governance people, trade agreements is something totally new, and we didn't have like familiarity with the trade agreements and how they can come up with rules for internet governance, because we've been discussing these issues. We've been discussing multi-stakeholderism in other forums, and we are trying to keep the core values of internet, such as multi-stakeholderism, where we interact and we try to find solutions. And then the e-commerce chapter has been released, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, there are rules here which are affecting us. So both Peter and I are coming from IP background. We have IP backgrounds for intellectual property lawyers, for intellectual property activists. It's a reality. We know that free trade agreements shape the future of intellectual property. But now, like as an IG community, we learned that they also shape the future of internet governance. So at IGF, like people express like frustration because like we were like, oh gosh, we've been discussing these issues, privacy, cross-border data transfers. By the way, please stick to the right terminology. This is not about information. We have to distinguish between data and information. The provision in the TPP is about cross-border data transfers. It's about data. It's not only the information. It also includes the metadata. It also includes the videos, music, and other stuff. So this is about the cross-border data transfers. And at IGF, we realized that what can we do? Like, we have to take trade agreements more seriously. But this doesn't mean that we are giving up on multi-stakeholderism. That should be the core value of the internet. That should be the core value for internet policy making. So I want to ask the panel, what's their take on the future of internet governance? So will we giving up on multi-stakeholderism, and will it be like IP? We go for free trade agreements and then we push back on industry demands? Or shall we continue making these discussions in other forums like IGF, WSIS, ICANN? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Future of internet governance?
Well, I have a paper coming out by the Commission on Internet Governance on that very topic. It should be out soon. And I basically, I don't know what I think about it, frankly, because on one hand, I am deeply worried that the internet, I would like to see the internet continue to have this ad hoc, multi-stakeholder approach to governance. But I also think I live in the real world, at least the last time I looked, and in the real world, frankly, more and more governments are creating their own set of rules to govern their internet, and they are becoming, I know the internet is a network of networks, but they're creating their own intranet, and they have a vision of information security, and that would be China, Russia, Kazakhstan, where governments essentially control information flows. And looking at it from both an economics perspective and a human rights perspective, as a realist, I want to ensure that access to information, which I think is, I know as a human rights person, I'm not supposed to say one right is more important than another. But the only way that I think countries can make progress is if they have greater access to information. And if people are empowered to be educated, to understand what their government is doing, to progress scientifically and technologically. And so I actually think if you look at the whole agreement, yes, there are negatives. Yes, there are positives. I'm going to say I think this is a net positive. Is it good enough? No. But I think you guys are ignoring some of the benefits. I think USTR is idiotic for saying this will enable the open internet, because then they have to prove it. And they have been unwilling to really address that, because what does covered persons mean is key to this analysis. I want to let other people speak, but if you want to, my brief goes into that. Covered persons is a very distinct term, and it does not explicitly cover netizens except for related to privacy. But that said, if you understand how trade agreements work, that is what the rules govern, service providers. And so you and I are covered indirectly by the rules governing service providers. Let me stop now. Mark, does anyone want to add anything?
Yeah. From a big picture perspective, I really hope it won't be a trade agreement that shapes the future of the internet. But from a privacy standpoint, right now, I think the good direction would be that it's a global fundamental right to be recognized. And now it's a unique moment for multi-stakeholderism, because we have the same fight all over the world. And now the US and European NGOs, but in Latin America as well, we have the same goals. And my first instinct would be to find a joint campaign among us. So I would definitely not give up on multi-stakeholderism. But I'm not very optimistic about the EU, as you said. The EU is still committed to the Safe Harbor 2.0, which is, in our point of view, completely unacceptable. So I don't see the Europeans' position strengthened at all, which is very frustrating for me. And it's for me, it seems like maybe sovereign countries there are, but the U.S. always gets what it wants if it's the Europe.
So a quick response, I think, should the discussions about internet governance take place in WSIS and IGF and ICANN, yeah, of course, they should definitely continue in that context and in those fora. But the news is that they're also going to take place in trade agreements. And that's a reality, and I think it's a reality that opens an opportunity for making forward progress.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you, Jean-François Wattin. Actually, two questions to the panel. I've not read the 2,000 pages of rules, but a few hundred, and I think it's extraordinarily intrusive and prescriptive on government. So what are the chances that it's going to be implemented, or that it's going to have the life of TRIPS, wonderful agreement on trade property rights, which actually was not implemented, has not reduced counterfeiting in any way? That was the first question. The second question is on the free flow of data and freedom of expression, because 3 weeks ago, I would have shared 120% what was said by the panel. Now, there was November 13, and every day we have the proof that the terrorists have been radicalized not by going to mosques, but by looking at internet sites. And I think maybe it should change our graal of free flow of information as being the ultimate that we should hope for in terms of promoting a civilization.
Okay, so what changes will TPP implement? We'll start there, and going forward, we'll go one question per person. But what changes will TPP implement? I guess was the first one. If the agreement takes effect, is that your question?
Is TPP going to happen?
No, that's not. The question is, because it's so intrusive. I mean, if you look, for example, at the labor chapter, I think it's relatively clear that the standard that is being set in the labor chapter is a higher standard than the one in the US today. So is it going to be implemented? Are we going to have hundreds of panels every year under the TPP? Or is it going to be like TRIPS? It's going to be words on a paper, but no implementation whatsoever. I think it's a valid question, but I'd like to know also the answer by the panel to my second question.
So is it enforceable? Yes.
Well, if I may, I'm hearing a fundamental contradiction in your two questions. On one hand, you're saying the standards are too high and they're not enforced, but then you're asking for higher standards to have censorship because you link it to terrorism, that people are getting access to hateful information on the internet. And I guess I'd say to you, from my own research, and again, I can only speak to that, I think the threat of a trade dispute does lead governments to do more to implement. But I think you're absolutely right to say in terms of online IPR. So we have to go subject by subject and look to see what's happened, what have been the results of these trade agreements. And the results are always a mishmash, right? Sometimes the standards have been met and fully enforced, but the standards are enforced by trade disputes, essentially, and by transparency through trade policy reviews, at least at the WTO, and through bilateral trade agreements. So there's no easy answer to your question.
Is anyone else? No?
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I'm really basically interested in one word, general public interest, and it means from the United States and other foreign countries. By that, I really cover a lot of topics. First, if you look at the big volume, that's the strategy, the pressure they put on a legislative proposal. And the way they do it is you look at it and you're tired, just like Patriot Act. And you look at it, you look too tired and forget it, just pass. And that means at the disadvantage of the general public. So people suffer, and especially foreigners, And if the trade representative, even if they have an interest, have an English proficiency, but general public, they don't. Even they have a trade, foreign trade, but they don't know just what's in there. And now we have provision probably say, investor, the country, they have a right to sue the foreign country, the government, and they can probably win the lawsuit, but the general public of foreign country had to pay the debt, just like before in the African country, they cannot afford to pay the debt, and then the interest of a few people, and that doesn't make sense for general public of other country, and it's unfair. And then
So do you have a question? What's your question?
My question is, for all this trade, are we going to protect the people of the United States and foreign country in many topics? That's what I'm saying, whether that is in terms of environment or whether that is in terms of trade condition, whether it is in terms the use of resources or their land or the land grabbing. You just lost everything. The people is not of any benefit of this trade.
So we're focusing on the digital side today. So what would your question be in terms
My
of?
question still focus on the general public, the interest of general public, both in the United States, our consumer, our general public, or taxpayers, and also for foreign countries, their general public, not just their trade representative. They pass. And then eventually the way
So how accessible is the agreement to the general public, and does it serve their
whether
interests?
their resources really lost to the corporations, and whether the general public have a use of the way that's called development, the public-private partnership, economic development. Those now are very unjust, very misleading.
Okay, let's give the panel a chance to. I mean, we have talked a lot about how privacy provisions affect the general public. Are there other areas of agreement that we want to?
Look, I'll give it a shot. I'm very sympathetic. That's a big agreement. And as the only person at my company who's charged with reading that agreement, I feel your pain. On the other hand, I think that the negotiators would have been criticized if they came up with a 5-page framework with general principles, because then no one would know what it really meant. So it's almost a can't-win situation. Part of the reason it's so detailed is to try to address some of these contingencies and future developments and try to anticipate and put rules in the road so people have a bit of certainty with what this actually means. Does that put an individual person at a disagreement? Yes. Are we thankful that there are groups here who have resources to weigh in with their perspectives? I think yes as well.
So Susan, to go to the first of your
Could
four...
you just introduce yourself first?
Sorry, Maddie Lotenbach from Wiley Ryan. The first of your 4 ifs was whether or not or if it would go into effect. So I guess my question along that line would be, do we have any insight as to when here in the U.S. it would be going for an up and down vote? And then as a quick follow-up to that, any thoughts on whether Hillary Clinton might change her position and how that might affect with timing for this vote and, of course, the elections coming up?
I'll try it, but I'm not going to give you a prediction because I think everybody here is smart enough not to give a prediction on this. There's been a lot of talk, and really I think there's a lot of jockeying around the agreement right now. The ITC has to issue a report, which I think is due sometime in May. Seems like there wouldn't be a vote before that. I know the administration's been trying to push the ITC along. Then you're in the middle of primary season for representatives out there, and especially on the Democratic side, where some members might be inclined to support it but don't want to be in that difficult position. So perhaps that pushes you till later in the fall, and then you've got the presidential election. So some people have said maybe there's a vote in a lame duck session. We'll just have to see. The timing of these things are all very difficult. My guess would be, and I haven't spoken to any of them personally, I think the Obama administration will push hard to get a vote on this before they leave office. This is something that's one of the president's key priorities. He sees it as, I think, part of his international legacy. So if I had to put money down, if you were forcing me, I'd say there will be a vote sometime this year, but perhaps later rather than sooner. Or rather in 2016.
And anyone crystal ball on Hillary Clinton?
She left a lot of room there. I think that was misinterpreted by the press, and she clearly had to take the position that she took. But she did leave room to rethink it. And clearly, Congress is going to insist on certain things. It has to be compared to TPA. So who knows where she'll end up on this, especially if she is elected president. But thank you for your question.
Anybody else? Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. Just for Peter, I guess. I mean, in this agreement, will the U.S. have to change any laws as a result of this agreement, or is it your concern that this agreement would prevent the U.S. from adopting, more forward-looking policies that you guys would like to promote?
Right. So I would certainly order the second concern over the first, but I can't speak authoritatively to the first because it's a massive agreement and lawyers are going to have different opinions. Some of that could wind up being litigated, and we don't really know. But in an area like, you're familiar with this biologics issue that we look at in access to medicines, where there's a preclusion of future policy space. We're limiting our ability to introduce biosimilar competition and lower medicine costs in the United States because of a rule that's in the agreement. I actually think that
Do you want to just back up and give a really quick summary, since that's something we haven't talked about?
I could. I was just going to use it as the access to medicine issues are all about the length and scope of the pharmaceutical industry's monopoly power versus when generic competition can come in and lower costs. There was a much debated rule at the end of it. Okay, all right. So my point for there was just for the context of internet governance, Doug knows that was an issue that we sort of debated a lot. I actually think that the privacy issue is maybe more serious in terms of its reach into American law and process, because as far as I'm aware, we really haven't legislated on this at all. It's it's a novel threshold question as a matter of law, whether you always have to move data or can condition it and under what circumstances and how that whole system is supposed to work. So that's one example of an area where we may be settling the question in TPP, or at least leaving it to the trade tribunals to work out for anything we pass, and that's dangerous.
So we're just about time. Do you want to do, is there one last 5 more minutes? Okay.
Can I just hop in on that one just for a second? And maybe this is a question for the Obama administration. I think it is. It's not for me. But if I'm not mistaken, they put forward a comprehensive proposal for a privacy bill of rights right back in 2012, I think. They're the ones who negotiated this agreement. I haven't heard them disavowing their desire for that kind of legislation. So maybe the question is for them. And I'm not taking any particular perspective on that proposal, but presumably they must. One would hope that if that's something they want, and if this is something they've done, that those are not incompatible. But you maybe should ask them.
Any other final questions? Yep.
Thank you. One quick question on the, David McCauley's my name with VeriSign, on the future of multi-stakeholderism when it comes into conflict with the multilateral trade agreement. And I want to put it in specific context, and that's geographic indications, which I believe the IPR chapter protects country names and in some circumstances, geographic indications. Well, that mirrors a debate that's breaking out in ICANN on whether geographic indications can be protected in domain names. And so my question is, what would be the interplay between a treaty like that and an ICANN rule that came out if they were not consistent? Does the treaty trump ICANN's ability to, maybe not a good word in this political context, but does it preempt the decision? Thank you.
Well, I'll try real quick. So I don't actually know. I'm sure others in the room do. Sort of what the binding or how ICANN rules function once they're implemented. What's that? Right. So I mean, what I was going to say is, but the TPP is binding, right? This is all sort of automatically executing. So unless ICANN has, if you have a conflict of laws, it gets complicated, I suppose. But I mean, but you have to comply with TPP. There's no option. So
If it goes into force.
if it goes into force,
And,
right?
you know, ICANN has been very inconsistent.
Just lean into-
ICANN has been very inconsistent in its policies on domain names, geographical indicators, and, you know, we had the Amazon, and then we had the .vin, and, you know, I think certainly TPP will have governing authority, or TTIP if it goes into effect, but this debate is about to happen. Watch these pages.
Do you want to wait for the microphone?
This is something we discussed at IGF when we had that workshop at IGF. There was Jeremy from ICANN, and he commented on this, and he was like, we discussed these issues days and nights for years and years. Here we are, here is the rule. So what was the point for us to discuss these issues at ICANN and like try to come up with like a consensus on these issues rather than they make the rules in trade agreements without asking us? So that's the reality of like trade agreements, and that's why we are concerned about trade agreements. We can discuss privacy here at IGF, at WSIS, but now the privacy is a trade exception, and we don't know how it will work. We have no idea. You can tell us that this is a great exception, but when you look at the WTO jurisprudence, it's not.
Well, we need to be very careful here. Okay, there has never been a case on privacy as an exception. There's never been a case on national security as an exception. I actually think that the relationship between surveillance and information flows, is really what we should be worried about, because we didn't talk about this, but there's a lot of language in TPP that is over my head, frankly, but basically we'll have to see where this plays out in terms of things like source code and sharing information. So let's just leave this for now. But on the other hand, I think many people who already reflexively oppose this, while I understand it, I think it is in some ways empowering, because I think it leads to this public debate about A, biologics, B, online IPR, privacy. I can only hope if we had a different Congress, we'd actually make some progress on those issues, but we have to live in the world in which we live in, and I am hopeful that it will start to get the U.S., which I think has been basically brain dead on some of these issues, to rethink our strategies, because it is going to be in a trade agreement. But again, remember that trade agreement, even though it governs information flows and covers 25% of the internet, does not cover how every country behaves if they're not a party to it or sending information to those countries. Okay, so just need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and try to be as balanced as possible about what does this mean, and try to influence the debate. And I know that sounds like Pollyanna, because I understand people are frightened, and they have a right to be frightened, but they have to, I think, look at some of the positives and look at some of the negatives, and then decide at large and over the long term, is this going to be good for netizens? In my judgment, which may be different from yours, is I think it will be, but I don't know, because it's dependent on a lot of ifs. Fanny and Peter, they disagree, and that's a good thing. Let's have this debate, because out of this debate, again, Pollyanna speaking, will come better trade policies. But I think trade policies is going to be where it's at, unfortunately.
Okay, that seems like a good place to stop for today. Thank you all so much for coming. Some panelists might stick around if you have extra questions, but we'll call it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I get your point totally.